Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. My name is Kirill Zukotsky. 40 years on from the world's worst ever nuclear disaster in Chernobyl, the global community is still having major concerns about nuclear safety, particularly exacerbated by the war in Ukraine.
The disaster on the Chernobyl power plant on April 26, 1986 still remains the world's worst nuclear disaster. The power plant sits in northern Ukraine, not too far from the capital Kiev. On the day of the disaster, reactor number 4 exploded, leading to a release in radiation. It also led to frantic efforts of the Soviet leadership to both scramble to contain the damage and try to hide it from the wider population. Due to the sheer magnitude of the disaster, that of course was not possible. 500,000 people were involved in the initial response and thousands died from direct radiation exposure or long-term health complications. Later that year, the sarcophagus over the exploded reactor was built and the exclusion zone around the power plant was created. This was not a viable long-term solution. About 10 years after Chernobyl, the global community understood the exploded power plant needed to be secured. As a result, what is known as the new Safe Confinement was built, a massive steel arch over exploded Reactor 4. It took 9 years and almost $2 billion to build, with funding coming from EU and G7 countries. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development led the project and launched the Chernobyl Shelter Fund. In 2019, the completed arch was handed over to Ukraine. It was meant to last for 100 years. Many thought Chernobyl issues would be solved for many generations. Less than 3 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the front line came through Chernobyl. The Russian military occupied the plant, with Russian tanks and armored vehicles driving through the territory and soldiers seizing officers. Ukraine managed to liberate the area. However, in February 2025, a Russian drone hit the arch. The strike damaged external and internal structures. Suddenly, we no longer have 100 years of safety, and the race is on to rebuild the damage from the Russian drone strike. We have only several years to do it, while the war is still going on.
40 years on after the Chernobyl disaster, with everything that's going on in the world, many people stopped paying attention and thinking this is an important but long-forgotten history. Yet, we know that this is still important and it's still having an impact. Could you tell us why the community in Europe, people around the world, should still pay attention to what is happening in Chernobyl and around Chernobyl?
Absolutely. Chernobyl has always been one of the world, if not the world's most vulnerable nuclear facilities. I think up until the start of the war, though that the attention had decreased on the question of Chernobyl, we were still doing some work there. But at the start of the war, you had not only the Russian attack on Ukraine coming down through Chernobyl and causing extensive damage in the exclusion zone to the site infrastructure, if not the nuclear infrastructure. And then on the 14th of February 2025, you had the drone attack on the new Safe Confinement, which was the first ever direct military attack on nuclear infrastructure, with fairly devastating consequences for the long-term sustainability of the confinement.
How big are consequences?
I think talking about consequences, we need to firstly explain what the confinement is and what it was designed to do. There were essentially two core functions for the new Safe Confinement. The first one was to confine against further releases of radiological contaminated material from the old sarcophagus and the destroyed reactor, which it sits over. And the second function of it was to enable to put in place all the facilities there to enable the deconstruction of the old shelter, so a complex piece of decommissioning equipment. Both of those core functions have been fundamentally compromised by the drone strike on the confinement. Firstly, because we don't have a confinement anymore, we have holes in the confinement, we don't have overpressurization, we don't have humidity controls, all essential parts of the long-term life of the structure. And because we don't have that, we don't have the capacity to start the deconstruction of the facility. And what will happen over the course of time, if there's no action, is the arch will slowly start to degrade even further to a point where it becomes almost impossible to repair.
So what work has been done so far to at least attempt and try to restore what was before the drone strike?
Well, there has been some temporary repairs done to the main area of the drone strike, which was a 15-meter square strike on the north side of the confinement. There's been a big damage assessment done to inform us of the extent of the damage, because a lot of the damage is not seen by the naked eye. It's in the internal structures of it, relating to fires that burned on the north side of the confinement on the cladding. We have in plans now to put in place some short-term interim measures, which will essentially stop the short-term degradation of the arch further. The big challenge is, how do we go to restore the functionality of the arch in order to get it to something like the design standards that we had before the Russian attack.
So when you say short-term, how short-term, what's the timeline here that we're talking about?
Well, currently you have a situation where you have holes in the cladding which are letting in water, which are slowly going to degrade the complexity of the cladding materials in the arch. So these need to be repaired in the immediate term. The big issue we face is corrosion of the existing structure, because there was what's known as an active corrosion control system, which is basically a humidity controls of the steel structure within an overpressurized space. It gets a bit technical, but basically what we're talking about is stopping moist air getting to the steel structure that could allow it to start corroding. That engineering capacity that we had with it, that now being destroyed. We think we have probably around 4 years to get the corrosion standards back up, the corrosion control standards back up to a level which is acceptable to stop corrosion taking hold. Once you get corrosion taking hold of the structure, it will become immensely more complicated to repair it.
How much time do we have now, once that short-term fix is in place, before we need to actually decide how to deal with possible bigger long-term consequences?
Well, we don't really have any time, to be perfectly honest. We need to move now. We estimate, or engineers estimate, that the existing structures will last probably until 2030 without the active corrosion system back in place. After that date, you have a risk of corrosion starting. So the current assessment is we have around 4 years to put in place the repairs, but there is an element of uncertainty on that figure that we have to try to narrow down through the work we're going to do over the next few months.
What kind of investment is needed to address this long term?
It's very difficult to give you a precise figure. A lot of people have asked, and I entirely understand why they ask these questions. The estimates that we had from our engineers who carried out the assessment of the damage was possibly in the region of 500 million euros. But that figure will need to be defined as we go through a further refinement of the repair options for the facility. The attack has put 20 years of progress in jeopardy, and I believe there will be a very strong momentum to make sure that jeopardy is mitigated.
If this is not addressed and this funding does not come where it's inadequate, and we're nearing the deadline of 4 years, what can happen further on down the line there? Complexity will increase, essentially. The arch will degrade, and it will degrade over time. And as it degrades, you have the difficulties we have of repairing the arch become more and more. The other issue is that the whole purpose of the arch was to enable the long-term deconstruction of the old shelter and the Unit 4 reactor that sits inside it over many decades, because it was recognized that was put in place completed in November 1986 in incredibly heroic circumstances, but was never built to last, and it needed to be firstly stabilized, which we did, and then slowly deconstructed. The capacity for deconstruction was there
put in place by the international community, handed over to Ukraine in 2019, that now doesn't exist anymore.
Obviously, the big elephant in the room is this is all happening in the war zone.
Yes.
So there was this Russian drone strike in February 2025, as you said, but there is a potential of another one or worse happening every day. How do you deal with that?
I think it's entirely justified to recognize that war massively complicates the path ahead for us. Chernobyl is already an immensely complicated site to work at, given the extra precautions we have to take and safety for workers, which is our number one priority. The short answer is that we can do the temporary repairs to stop further degradation in the short term under the current circumstances. However, the longer term work is going to need some time to define it, possibly a year of analysis and procurement and early engineering to look at the options. We very much hope by that time that we will have a ceasefire or the war will be ended. If not, we're going to have to think of some alternative solutions of how we manage the repairs in a wartime scenario. But let's not pretend it's going to be exceptionally complicated. It's just a fact we have to deal with.
Obviously, there is Chernobyl and you're dealing with Chernobyl. There was another decommissioned nuclear power plant in Ignalina in Lithuania, which was very similar to Chernobyl. So those are decommissioned plants. There are active plants in the region, be it the new one in Belarus or the one in Zaporizhzhia in eastern Ukraine. And this whole region, as we discussed, the war zone or general instability and possible security risks are been discussed open and public about what may happen next.
Yes.
What this says general about the need to think about nuclear safety, and what do you think people in Europe and elsewhere in the world should think about and do about it?
I think we should look at what the International Atomic Energy Agency say about this, where they have been very active, and they have introduced a program called the 7 Indispensable Pillars of Nuclear Safety in Times of War, which are guiding principles of what is needed to safeguard nuclear facilities. And these are actually some relatively common sense, simple things like free access to site for workers working without stress, clarity of supply chains for spare parts, regulatory access to the facilities. And if you look at these 7 indispensable pillars, we can see that certainly at Zaporizhzhia and to a large extent at Chernobyl at various times since the start of the Russian attack on Ukraine, all of these so-called indispensable pillars of nuclear safety have been compromised. And that is a tremendously worrying fact.
What is still the environmental impact and damage that still such a gigantic nuclear disaster as Chernobyl can have 4 or 5 decades later?
The big impact that we look at is how do we deal with the long-term legacy of the destroyed reactor? And it's worth recognizing that estimates have something like 95% of the radiological inventory of Unit 4 still sit in Unit 4. So basically 4 or 5% of the radiological inventory was released into the environment at the time of the 1986 accident. The remainder of it is still sitting in various locations in the lower destroyed Unit 4. And there needs to be a solution to how we secure that and how we secure the old facilities. We had that solution in place, which was the new Safe Confinement, that allowed Ukraine to look to the future with confidence that they could deal with the long-term consequences with safely and securely, with very modern equipment, with remote handling where necessary. And that confidence has now been shattered. That, for me, is the key risk that we need to face now. At the time of the drone strike, there was a small spike in radioactive releases from the shelter, but they've fairly soon after the strike reverted to what technical experts would refer to as control levels, so the expected levels around the site. So it's not really a short-term radiation risk that suddenly we're going to have a major new crisis on our hands. What it is a long-term risk that the facilities that we put in place, which were recognized as important for 20 years, which is why all the effort was put in place to deliver them, they are now effectively rendered redundant as a result of this attack.